first author, Paul Yoon, a highly acclaimed author, is known for his unique blend of evocative prose and deep explorative themes like displacement, memory, and the impact of history on individual lives. Paul began his literary journey with his debut novel, Once the Shore, which stood out for its lyrical storytelling and intricate character studies. Yoon's subsequent works, including Snow Hunters, which won the Young Lions Fiction Award, continue to intrigue with subtle narratives that resonate with emotional truth. His writing, which often traverse different landscapes and time periods, is a product of his meticulous research and of profound empathy for his characters. Through this novel and short stories, Yoon has established himself as a significant voice in contemporary literature and left an indelible mark, earning critical acclaim and a dedicated readership. Paul's latest novel, The Hive and the Honey, the winner of the Story Prize, and in 2023 named the Best Book of the Year by the New Yorker, Vanity Fair, I forgot my glasses, Library Journal, Electric Literature, and the New York Public Library, and described by Sabir Sultan of PEN America as expansive, haunting, and intimate, and shows Yoon as at the height of his powers. I personally was captivated by this book, especially the never knowing when a story was going to end feeling and the sensation of not wanting it to end. If you haven't yet, I highly recommend reading and purchasing, possibly, Mr. Yoon's new short story collection, The Hive and the Honey. Its journey is well worth not missing. Also joining is our author, Shannon Sanders. Ms. Sanders is a distinguished author celebrated for her compelling narratives and profound emotional insight. Her literary works, characterized by nuanced characters, development, and intricate plot lines, deftly explore themes of resilience and the complexities of human relationships. Sanders' debut novel, Company, is not just a book, but a world you can step into. It received critical acclaim and earned her the National Book Award of Fiction and the 2023 Los Angeles Times Art Seidenbaum Award for the first fiction, marking her as a significant voice in contemporary literature. Her portfolio includes several other works, such as short stories and essays, recognized with various awards, including the PEN Faulkner Award for Fiction. Sanders' ability to connect with readers through relatable themes and rich, immersive words has solidified her status as an influential figure in the literary community. Personally, Company was not just a book for me, but a mere reflection of my own experiences. It took me 3 times as long to read it as it should because I kept stopping to call my sister to say, "Hey, remember when?" If you have not yet, I strongly encourage you to spend time with Company. The discussion today will be moderated by Hannah Oliver Depp, a bookseller, a bookseller and the owner of Loyalty Bookstores, with locations in Washington, D.C. and Silver Spring, Maryland. She is known for her advocacy within the book-selling community, particularly in promoting diversity and inclusivity in the book industry. Depp has been involved in various panels and discussions about important and diverse books. Her contributions extend to her active participation in the American Bookseller Association and other industry groups, where she works to support independent booksellers' interests and champion the cause of diverse literature.
Thank you both so much for joining today. I'm big fans of you both, so I'm delighted for the excuse to talk to you. If I had like my druthers, I would just like drag my favorite authors and make them talk to each other. So Gaithersburg Book Festival is kind of a fantasy for me. So thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to kick us off. Shannon, if you would just tell us a little bit about Company, and then I'm going to make you do the same thing, Paul. So give us a little hit of what this beautiful book's about.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for moderating, and thank you for having me here. Company is my debut. It's a short story collection, and the stories are fairly tightly linked. So it includes 13 short stories that follow the members of a few generations of one Black family in cities along the East Coast. So mostly around D.C., Philadelphia, Atlantic City, New York. And the stories kind of follow the members of this family and explore some of the legacies and inheritances that have been passed down. And then the title refers to the fact that each story is hinged on a moment where company arrives. So either someone is hosting a gathering, or someone drops in unexpectedly, or there is a holiday. And sort of the ways that the family's legacies are come into tension and conflict as a result of those guest-host interactions.
Nothing brings up tension more than your family coming to stay with you.
Exactly.
Paul?
No, I think that's, well, first of all, so honored to be with you both here, and thank you all for showing up, especially in this weather. No, but I think for me, you know, that idea of family is for sure something that I was echoing with this project as well. I grew up, you know, with long story short, my dad, you know, was a North Korean refugee who sort of survived the war, was able to come to America in the 70s, and so growing up, I'd sort of be like, oh, you know, I'd always wonder about like sort of extended family and where they were, and he would just have no answer for me because he didn't know either, right? And so there was this sort of, you know, blank space, and I think I'd always wanted to tackle a project where I was sort of imagining like limbs of a family tree, if that makes sense. Like, where are all these people that I've never met? And that's basically what the book is. Each story is a kind of imagined limb of a very fictionalized family tree, and kind of like spans a few centuries of the Korean diaspora. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually do want to delve into like time and place a little bit, because they're, you know, it's like, oh, shocking. Setting is important to the book. I know it's like a really shocking piece of information. No. But it is really like being from here and having family like up and down, specifically the Mid-Atlantic, and like the fact that that is a very specific region with very specific tastes and histories and intergenerational family legacies. And you've got, you know, such strong sense of the Mid-Atlantic community, especially amongst Black families. But as we are all smushed together in this relatively small space, we're all interacting with each other, right? But you have, you know, it's a intergenerational family story, and you cover a few generations of the family, and you're covering hundreds of years, literally. But also, it is still so interconnected via like either the idea of place or like the actual physical place that they're in, because some of your characters are traversing long distances. Some of them are, in fact, obsessed with trying to find their way back somewhere, right? When you are like setting up to write a short story, because I think of short stories quite often as character studies, right? Like we just kind of get dropped into something and we have to figure some stuff out really quick. So we tend to focus on character, but I think quite often like place and time are much sneakier in a short story and affect us really deeply in a way.
Yeah, 100%. And I think for me, I don't know, like how you, I'll be curious to hear how you sort of construct stories, Shannon, like just on an earlier draft stage. But for me, it's, and I don't know if I just secretly want to be a painter or something, but it's always this kind of physical canvas, or not physical, but there's this kind of imaginary canvas in my mind that I'm trying to fill. And so if character is something that's being formed, then that's like sort of one corner of that canvas. Or if place is something that's kind of resonating with me at first, then that's kind of like one layer of the canvas. But then it's a question of how do you like fill the entire thing, and how do you keep going, right? And those are like the, whether that's character, movement of time, place, filling in place more, those are the things I'm thinking about. But eventually trying to complete that painting that I don't know like how to complete at first, right?
Yeah, I guess two things. So number one, most of the time I gravitate towards stories that take place in sort of small time and space windows. And so I really like to try to build out a single moment and layer it with whatever the meaning and substance is. And so that's why a lot of the stories in this book take place at a party, you know, and so you've got a character wandering through like a garden trying to find her friends or whatever. And I think that setting develops pretty organically as a result of trying to make an authentic place for the story to take place in. And then the other thing is that for a linked short story collection, one of the really fun things is that you get to sort of build a portrait of a place through looking at it from different perspectives within that place. So you've got, a young person's DC when she is maybe a grad student who is trying to explore M Street. And then you've got the older academics DC when she's trying to impress her friends, And I think all those things kind of come together, particularly by the time you get into the second or third story that takes place in that same setting. So the portrait takes shape, I think, throughout the stories, maybe more than in any one of them.
When you set out to write a story, obviously you're kind of like, oh, I have like a sense of a corner of this painting, or like I'm obsessed with like this moment. Do you know it's a short story?
Yeah, I do. So I love short stories.
Me too.
And,
yeah.
I did a lot of workshopping early in my short story writing career. And of course, you go to a workshop and you send out your short story, and the people in the workshop always say, I felt like this was the beginning of a novel. Like that's the most common response, I think, in a workshop setting. And typically, I would always know, no, it's not. Like it takes place. It's in this confined space, because part of the challenge is to build a world within that word count, and also to make it feel as though it expands beyond that word count. So I always knew that these were short stories, but people did call that to question sometimes, and I sometimes got like tempted to rethink, but yeah, they always were short stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm 100% there. Like for me, I always think it's going to be a short story. Like even I wrote 2 like novels, but it was just because like I always thought they were going to be short stories, and they're actually short novels. They're very short, and I think it's because it's my first love. Like I fell in love with short stories, and like love, you sort of want to respond to it, right? And that's how I started writing, was because I loved reading short stories. But I love this idea of, Shannon, you were talking about sort of, focusing on like a very small amount of time, just to go back to time.
Yeah.
And then kind of just like digging as deep as possible, like in those moments. And something that's really gratifying to me about the short form is the challenge of that, to do that like in a short amount of space, right, in pages, but also like to think less about, like, I don't know if there are a lot of writers in this space right now, but when you're crafting something, it's like, rather than think of like A to B, like how do you get a story from A to B, and push it forward in that kind of linear way, like what are all the things that you can do as a writer to make it feel like as kind of layered and vertical as possible, right? Which is, I think, what you were doing, right? And that's a fun, challenging, beautiful aspect of this art form, is to focus less on the A to B and more on that verticality. Yeah,
totally. And like the idea of I would definitely, when I'm hand selling these books, I'm like, this is an interwoven short story collected. They're related. They're all individual. Like you can pick it up and put it down or whatever, but there's a pleasure in like the recurring overlapping narrative. It's not just that these people are related to each other throughout a few decades. It's that these people are, like, you're seeing again, like DC over the years, you're seeing some of the same places come up. You're seeing that cousin being referenced, and like the way one generation thinks about that cousin versus another, right? So they're interwoven truly, but also standalone, which is very, I don't know, like it's not a novel. These are truly short stories, and your collection is thematically related, but they're not. I would not think of them as interwoven short stories, right? When you're like crafting that, I'm interested like from a like both a pitch perspective and like a craft perspective, right? When you're like, these are standalone short stories, I'm like, but what's the theme, Paul? Like, I feel like that was they like demanded of you for the elevator pitch. And then when you're like, they're short stories, not a novel, and they're like, but they could be a novel, right? Like, what are the editorial and like publishing tensions and pushback when you're like trying to create these collections?
Okay, well, so I got really lucky because I ended up matching with an agent and an editor who really championed short stories, and that was really important to me. I really didn't.
You were with the excellent Grey Wolf Press.
Yeah,
too.
so the
wonderful
book was
publisher.
published by
The excellent
Wonderful.
Grey
The
Wolf.
excellent
Yeah.
Grey Wolf
Yeah.
Press. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, and they were so behind keeping them as short stories and making sure that they had that identity. And interestingly, it's being published in the UK as well. It actually just came out last week.
Oh, congratulations!
And, thank you. And their sensibility is a little bit different in that way. And the UK publishing team really wanted to sort of make it ambiguous. What is this? Is this? They didn't want to say stories. It's not on the cover. And so in like sort of the press, they call it a celebration of family, which I love and which I think is accurate.
True. Yeah.
Surely, but so I got really lucky, I think, is the short answer, in that we respect the identity of short stories as an art form, as a team, so author, agent, editor, and I did not feel a lot of pressure in that way, but I definitely did have, I guess I'll say the other thing is that many of the stories had been published individually before they ended up in the book, and so I had kind of a sense of which ones worked on their own, which ones needed like a little bit of connective tissue to make them work better, and all that stuff ended up, I lucked out in a lot of ways. Yeah.
That's the fun part, though, is forming when you have like a collection, or when you're thinking about forming a collection, you have a group of stories. Like, how do you actually make that into a book?
Yeah.
And then starting to think about, like placement, and if one story ends this way, is that like a good sort of like path into the second story, and how that second story starts, and thinking about all that and the through lines of like theme, recurring imagery, like all that stuff, right? That's like, to me, that's like the super fun aspect
like a
of the
mixtape.
book. Yeah, that's right, exactly right.
It's
yeah.
Exactly like a mixtape. Yeah.
Oh, if only. Do those still exist?
Oh yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they that like playlists, I guess, but like I will. My staff makes fun of me because I'm like, don't skip. The tracks are in order for a reason.
For a reason.
We're curating a vibe, guys.
The design of the
Do not hit shuffle.
The cover is there for a
Hate
reason.
shuffle. But yeah, I mean, I do think like there is an arc, and like one story does impact your reading of the other.
Yeah. But just quickly, I'm with Shannon. I'm very lucky to have a team who's very supportive of what I do, and it's just been nothing but love for like whatever it is that I want to do. So
I love that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we're I think we're both very lucky
you both
in
have
that way. Yeah.
It's very supportive
Yeah.
presses who. Yeah, if you go to an indie bookstore, be like, how many like FSG, how many Grey Wolf books? Like, that's because they're fellow book nerds, but we can definitely tell them. So I mean, but speaking of like crafting if you're me and I'm making my mixtape, which is the closest I will come to a short story collection, I think. But you're like constantly being like, okay, it's 2 weeks later, and after listening to this, I'm gonna need to move this up to the third song. Like how much time do you spend, or flow it, like figuring out what stories flow into each other if they are published individually, or if you're like crafting a collection?
I think for me, one way I do that is I read everything out loud, and maybe I don't know if the auditory, the musicality is a recurring theme for this conversation, but and I think that helps certainly is when you're in that mode of not sort of writing or staring at a screen, whatever, but like but then using your voice instead, you pick up on sort of different things, right? So that's one way, and also trusted readers, right? I've had 2 or 3 trusted readers for a very, very long time, and so one thing I'll do, and at this, we've been working together for so long, it's sort of shorthand now, where I'm like, hey, this is what I'm trying to do, this is what I'm trying to do, is it working? Is my intent there? Like, are you seeing it? And all that stuff. So, yeah. And that's important to have that community, right? That you trust.
Yeah.
Yeah. Readers.
Yeah. Echo that for sure. Having people that you trust who can tell you, I don't think that quite works, and you won't take it the wrong way.
For sure.
I also, again, for linked short stories, I wanted there to be little rewards for people who had stuck with it through the whole thing. Yeah. And so I knew I wanted to start with something that was going to make the reader excited to continue. I wanted there to be a certain mood at the very end. I wanted the reader to close the last page and feel a little bit happy, optimistic. Yeah. And then in between, I kind of wanted the reader to wander through and have little moments of thinking, oh, I didn't think that she was like that, about various characters. I wanted to include what I hoped were little like revelations about characters or, pieces of family history or whatever. And so I tried to set it up for that kind of experience. But of course, you don't get to control the way that a reader approaches the book, and so all the time I know that there are readers who are just opening to whatever story has the most appealing title. So, yeah, I know, and
I'd never read out of order. That's crazy. Again,
Blows
don't
my
hit
mind.
shuffle. God.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
This would be a great T-shirt.
I believe it very deeply. This became a different diatribe than I initially planned on it being. But yeah, I mean, I think there is a temptation to think that, to be like, oh, the theme is, loneliness or whatever. I was like reading reviews for both of your books, and they were correct that they're great books. And then they were like just really going like, and then it was sad. And I'm like, I don't know if that's actually like the main takeaway I took from these stories. But I think there is a theme of loneliness, but it's loneliness of like trying to find something versus loneliness of being found a little too much, maybe. Like it's like being lonely in a group of people who are supposed to know you the best, and then being lonely because you're literally searching for home.
But I also think many things can be true at once, right? Where you can experience, like, if each story is a journey, then you can follow that, to a dark place or a lonely place. But hopefully, in these, if what we're trying to achieve are these layered stories, there are other emotions and other sort of paths of light and hope, and all that. That's kind of all playing together, right? So, I think, right? Yeah.
That sounded great. Yes. I was like, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, the loneliness of being seen a little bit too much, because, I do think that in the stories, you've got this thing where all of us are part of at least two different communities. One is the family that we come from. One is the generation that we belong to. And any two communities that you belong to, their overlapping values are going to be, a sliver, or maybe a wider sliver, maybe a thinner sliver. Yeah. And so there's always going to be that tension in trying to perform to the standards of one and then maybe falling short in the other. And so there's that loneliness of belonging very much, but then also being in tension with the people around you. So I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, So I'm like switching gears, but I'm not, because I wrote this as like my first question for y'all, and then also I've been rereading Alice Munro, who recently passed away, who's like one of my all-time best writers I think who's ever lived, and is a short story master, like actual master. And I was reading these like really lovely obits for her all over the scene, and they were like, she only ever wrote short stories, and I was like, what's that only doing there? Like, what that like, no, she didn't only write, like, she wrote short stories, right? And
also not true, she had a novel.
I know she does have a novel.
So it's just not true.
And I was like, she has a novel, and I was like, the reason you think that is because those short stories like could block out the sun, like they were that good. But I like, that was a very funny comment that I kept seeing come up, like on the, like, not in the like journalistic piece or whatever, but like they're known for short story collections, and people like, yeah, and it's weird she only wrote short stories, and I was like, she didn't, but
and only 3 other writers in this country in the entire history ever did that.
Yeah, and I was just like, what? But it was interesting to me that like the looming, I don't know, presence of the novel in like literature, that's like, that is somehow the ultimate goal. And like, I'm literally like professional book nerd. Like, obviously I love novels, but I mean, I think short stories were my first love. Like, I think whenever someone can like make a tight short story collection where you're like, no skips, again, music, I don't know, but I'm like, every single one of these stories needs to be in here. They're affecting me. Like, I'm thinking about them later. They're like, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the privilege of, like a middle length novel. There's room in there to spread out or whatever, but like, you cannot miss a sentence in a short story, right?
Oh my gosh,
yeah.
Yeah, that's so true. And Alice Munro, I guess maybe she's one of the more vocal people to have said, I'm not interested. I'm sticking with short stories, and maybe that's why people associate that with her. But like you said, I mean, like, there's no only about it.
Yeah.
I'm working on a novel at this point, and the process is so amazingly different, mostly for the reason that you just said. Like, with a novel, you've got so much space to stretch out, and you can really wander around, and if you feel like doing that, you can. And I think that reading experience is one that is valuable, and people really enjoy it, obviously, and they get immersed. with a short story, though, there is no, like, it's okay if these next 3 sentences just fill that in. You know, there's no real space to color things in that way, unless it's really going to serve the story. So it's so different.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't really. I mean, I'm just trying to think of like a fast way to encapsulate this. But for me, like, it's this in this like kind of community of writers. I just sort of think of it as it's like a very, very big house party, you know, and there are a lot of people in it. There are a lot of wonderful people in it, you know, and the party's raging, and it's awesome. But I sort of just my personal experience is that I feel like I found, you know, a corner in a room in a very comfortable couch, and while I'm also enjoying the party, I'm also enjoying sort of being in that corner, right? And Shannon's in another room, in another corner, or in the same room maybe. Rachel's like in another floor, rocking it, you know. And it's just sort of like it's this one kind of like great place to be, and so like. For me, whatever it is I'm tackling, and it's always going to lean toward the short form, you know, whatever my publisher wants to call it. To me, it's always like on the shorter end, and I'm very proud and happy to be engaging with that form over and over and over again for as long as I can, you know? Yeah.
I'm team short story novella or 800-page book. Like I like the extremes. Give me
the extremes.
I
love that.
I'm like, you got to really earn those pages.
All right, Shannon, it's going to be 800 pages.
Are you ready?
Oh my gosh, it's heading that way. I'm really bad at editing. So
that's awesome.
Be like, I know one bookstore that's going to definitely carry this. I think for like your like when you are going in and you're looking again, like you're not necessarily sure, like, yes, I think this is a short story collection, or this is a short story at least that I'm writing. Do you have a troublesome person or a point in which it, like, you know, like, because I think there's such like one of the things I love about short stories, I'll start back at the actual beginning of this question, is again, a pleasure of a novel is sometimes you get lost in it and you're kind of floating around in it in a while, and it's like affecting you during the reading process. And it's not that short stories don't affect you during the reading process, but like you kind of finish the story and then it kind of hits you. At least that's my personal experience, and it'll like haunt me a little bit afterwards. And especially if it is interwoven or a theme comes up again in the next story, or whenever I come to it, I find that the short story sort of floats around after you in a way that that the novel might not. And so I'm curious if there is like a little bit of we're going to talk about haunting as a theme in both of your books, but I'm wondering if there's a character or a story from these collections that are sort of following you around a little bit after.
Okay, I might need to think about this for a minute. I guess.
You can talk more about mixtapes while you think about it.
Okay.
No, talk
I wrote a story that was sort of it was the most far in history that I've ever gone.
Yeah.
Which is Edo period Japan, and the main characters are sort of these retired samurai.
Yeah, I will say, like, I opened up the book and I was like, Paul? Like that was definitely
it just
different
sounds
for you.
bonkers. So, but you just read it, and
it's great.
But I think that for some reason, like those two badgered, warriors, they sometimes slip into my mind a little bit. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I guess for me, there's 13 stories. Almost all of them center on different characters, and there are different ways in which I identify with all of them, but I think that the character that I probably feel is the most like a projection of me is the one who is, she's older than I am, she's close to 60, but she's an academic, she's about to become provost at a university, and she is very concerned with being perceived the right way, people not underestimating her intelligence and all that kind of stuff. And she, and that's the one that I think about the most because I come across people in many different settings who are being microaggressed and having things like that really become sources of self-consciousness, shame, and tension for them. So, yeah, that's probably the one.
Yeah, she follows me around too. I think there is in another life I was prepping to be a full-time academic, and opened a bookstore instead. Very normal trajectory. But I was like, oh my God, this is kind of what I thought my life was going to be.
I think like short stories, it's almost like poems. Like when you read a poem, it just sort of haunts you, right? And if you read a short story, I think sometimes it may not be the character that's staying with you, right? It's like sort of like the last movement of the piece or like an image. And I think that's just as powerful too, right? Yeah.
There's definitely, there's like, it's like the kind of like, I'm not the first person, this is, narrative theory 101, but it's like a good story like feels like the perfect closing of a lid, right? And I think like short stories really give you that satisfying like clasp sound almost. All right, well, get ready with your audience questions. We're about to transition into that, so be mulling, be thinking. We have an incredible microphone here ready for you, so raise your hand, please. But I do want to say, like, my last question is, I think the short story forces us to be more of a participant as a reader, maybe than a bit of a spectator sometimes. And obviously different novels, especially different genres, like really pull you in different ways. But because you're given a little bit less intro and you're kind of dropped in so often into these people's lives and you only have so much time with them, sort of what you think about. Do you think about an audience being involved in the story in a different way than maybe they'd be involved in a novel?
I don't know if I think of an audience, to be perfectly honest, Hannah. What I do think about are, like, you just to go back to kind of like this idea of falling in love, right? Like, and falling in love with short form. And, like, I think about the writers that sort of inspired me and their stories, and I think, I don't know if this sounds like way too cheesy or, something, but I think I write as a response to like the stories that I love, right? And so I'm thinking about like the writers that I love and their stories when I'm working on something. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so and like Alice Munro, who is like one of my heroes and one of the greats, and I think about her often, and so it's like I think that's what's kind of like pushing me when I'm engaging with this art form. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do think about the audience as I'm working on a story, and I do in a couple ways. The first being that they always tell you that, rather than trying for universality, you try to make something that you think that one person will like, and maybe it's a particular person. So often I'm writing to one of my close friends. But then on the other hand, I think very much about being a reader. And like you said, the stories that I appreciate. And I think about the experience that I've had where something really clicked for me, or maybe even on the third read where I saw that the writer did something that I didn't recognize until then. Yeah. And I am often thinking about, I always start with an ending. That's always where I start in drafting a story. And then the question becomes, okay, how do I bring the reader to this ending that I already see, And so I often am thinking about a reader, and it's usually, again, like that one close friend or whatever. And it's like a guide that just holds your hand and walks you through the story in a way.
Totally. I think Rebecca, there's this beautiful short story writer named Rebecca Curtis, and some of her stories, actually, the way she sort of like drafts them is she pretends that she's writing a letter to her friends. So each story is a specific letter to her friend, and it kind of enters this sort of. And so when you read these zany stories, there's moments where you feel like you actually like there's something personal there between her and whoever she's writing the story for, and it leads to kind of like this interesting experience as a reader. Yeah.
Rebecca Curtis, look her up. She's great. All right, do we have any audience questions? Oh yes, right behind you.
Well, sorry I was a little late, but I think that this was definitely a divine appointment because I love short stories and I love to read them and I love to write them. And I just wondered if there is a good market for short stories. People still reading them.
The practical question. I love it.
I'm not sure.
I was gonna say, I was like, dude, should I answer that question? Yeah. So I'm a professional bookseller. That's why they're saying that. But I think so. It's a very funny thing. We get told, and independent bookstores obviously are a very specific slice of the market versus your Targets or Amazon or like the things that are moving, 10,000 units, etc. But the answer is absolutely yes. I think that sometimes it takes people. it depends on where people are on in their reading journey. If you were like scarred in high school by a terrible English teacher, you hate short stories. Like, and it definitely, like, I will tell you from many like 15 years of book selling, these are the conversations that you have. Yes, people, or they'll play plays, or like there will be something that they were like, that person was like, they made me dissect this, and I was like, that's not reading. And it's a bummer. But they also have the opposite true, where like you might be deeply affected by one and it follows you for your life, and then you're like, I'm chasing that feeling. So I think short stories often take someone to hand sell them in a way that maybe just like a novel or a different genre might not. But we will get told like by publishers, like, I don't know if it's going to be really hard to sell this short story collection, and they absolutely fly. So I think, again, it is the indie market, so it's more specific, but I think it's definitely, there's a huge market for it. And the other thing that I will say is, as things change in how people are reading, we have huge influx of audiobook reading. Accessibility is very important for e-reading, like for, they're printing less large print books, so being able to read on a device and make the print larger is an accessibility issue. Short stories are increasing popularity on those devices too, which is really important. And then finally, we live in a sort of tough world. I'll say that politely and pretend like that's a good summary of it. There's beauty, there's toughness, there's whatever, but a lot of us need escape, and people are trying not to escape necessarily like onto social media, but that's like an easy reach. So if I tell them like, it's a short story, you can read it in a night, and they're like, oh, thank God. Like they want the escape, but they feel intimidated by a huge text. So people are actually very grateful when you're like, you can read this before bed and it'll be great. So yes, there is a market. It's actually growing, not shrinking. But there's kind of an old prevailing industry standard that like short stories don't move, but it's just not true.
It's really lovely to hear, actually. Yeah.
Let me tell you. Yeah. From the ground.
First of all, yay independent bookstores.
Thank you.
Second of all, yay Gaithersburg Book Festival.
Yes.
And yay short stories, and thank you both for being here today. Just wanted to know how you got into writing. Who were your influences? Yeah, what made you want to start writing?
Yes. Well, okay, so I think this is probably the most common answer to this question, but I'm a lifelong lover of books. So I was a pretty voracious child reader, and I started writing way back then. And then in high school and college, I was really into writing fan fiction. I was, I was a super nerd, and so I just started. I kind of cut my teeth on watching things I liked and then writing stories about the characters in those things. And then I did some literary magazine stuff in college, and then right around 2015, I started to take workshops at the Writer Center, which actually they have a booth over there.
Go visit the Writer Center.
Yeah. And I took several workshops there, and I just began to, I had not really written short stories that were not fan fiction up until that point, but I began to do it. I workshopped them with a bunch of really cool people. It's sort of like an all levels, very accessible way to get into it. And I found that I really loved doing it. And then I ended up with enough to start to send them out to magazines, and from there built a collection. So that's kind of how that went.
Yeah, I think around the same time. I think this is going to sound really silly, but for a long time, I did not know that fiction was, or poetry, was an active art form that was alive and well, that there were people alive doing it. And that was just simply because, high school English class or whatever, we were just reading a lot of books with people who had passed away decades ago. And so I just had a very kind teacher who I think just saw something in sort of, my interest in reading, and started just passing me contemporary works of fiction and poetry as well. So, and it just kind of, it's just, again, this sounds really silly, but it just sort of, it rocked my world.
I was the same way. I don't think I read like a book by an alive person until I was like 19, and then I was like, what? We're still doing this?
I know. It was like, what? Yeah. And then that changed everything. It just, and then suddenly I was like, I have to respond to this. This is, and I want to be a part of it. So, yeah.
Oh yeah, interestingly, I read a lot of fantasy growing up, and for some reason, like I didn't join the two things together. That like, yes, people are still writing, but they're also still writing short stories. They're also still writing poetry. You know, it's so funny.
Right.
But what are some of your influences for the second part of that question? Some fave authors who either now or as a youth.
As a youth, it was Toni Morrison, and every time I would make like a screen name for any new platform, it would be like Tony something.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I hope you chatted up a lot of people on AOL Instant Messenger back in the day. Toni Morrison.
And then on the contemporary side, lots of short story writers that I really love right now. So Danielle Evans is probably my one of my most seminal influences, and then Disha Filia, of course, is in the same space, and she's wonderful. There's a writer named Lisa Tadeo, who's New York based, and she's better known for her nonfiction and her novel, actually, but her short stories were a humongous, they just really made me so excited to get back into writing. And on and on. I could name like a whole bunch of short story writers, and I do love novels too, but there are many.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about Alice Munro, who's a huge influence, and who recently passed away, so that's a huge, devastating loss. I read a lot of her. I read a lot of Deborah Eisenberg and Ann Beatty. Edward P. Jones I read. When Lost in the City came out, that was just life-changing for me. Is he in Maryland? He might
was.
Be
I don't know if he still is.
I think he still is in Maryland, yeah.
Yeah, he's one of my heroes. This late writer named John Berger, who was also an art critic, and he wrote like this trilogy of short story collections called Into Their Labors, set in this sort of small mountain community in France, and sort of traces like sort of all their years, and that was a life-changing experience to read too. So yeah.
Good tips. I think we have time for one more question.
So I'm in law school now, and reading is no longer fun for me.
I'm so sorry.
So as writers, I'm sure you've probably gone through a period where you're reading a lot and you sort of getting stuck and you're like, I don't know if I enjoy this. Have you gone through a period like that, and how did you sort of get your love back for reading or stepping outside of your comfort zone and reading and absorbing material in different manners?
Ooh, okay, so I have news for you. I won't call it bad or good. So I went to law school. I'm an attorney as my day job, and I went through that exact same period where it was just really not fun to read, even things that I had really loved before, because I just was consuming so much for school that there was just not a lot of space left over. But two things. Number one, short stories. Again, I think that's one way to get back into it, because they are low investment. You know, some of them are very, very short. There's flash, there's micro. The other thing is that I think community really helps with that, because if you have friends who are reading things that they are excited about, you know, that excitement can be contagious. Sometimes you don't want to be left out of the conversation. So it is, you know, it's motivating to try to get through something before you see somebody that, you know, is going to want to talk about it. And then also, you know, some of the best advice that I've gotten about both reading and writing is to follow the heat. So if you're not excited about it, just put it down. Literally, just don't worry about it.
It's okay to walk away.
Yeah. If you're not loving the book, just put it down. But if you are loving it, lean into it and go get something else by the same author.
Yeah, I mean, just to add, I think when you sort of think about what it is that's making you like not love so much or fall out of love, like whatever that genre is that you're thinking about, you know, I would actually just try a different genre. Try reading, you know, some poems, you know, if like you're kind of tired of reading fiction, move over to poetry and read poems. And I think it'll just kind of, the reading experience will just change entirely, and like how you're using your brain, and it might just be worth experimenting in that way. Yeah.
Definitely recommend hitting up the library and trying some different genres too. And I will, when I get in a huge reading slump, which happens all the time, like as someone who literally has to read professionally, and I'm just like, walking away from something you're not reading was totally anathema to me. Like if I didn't like it, like giving up on it, I was like, turns out like you hate less books if you don't force yourself to read them.
Yes.
And I will say, like, just echoing Shannon, you're not alone. I would say this is like, I mean, obviously I have a DC bookstore. There's a lot of lawyers. But it's like the most common like law school loss of love of reading. Like it will come back and it's okay. But we get like a ton of people walking in and be like, law school is killing my reading. And I'm like, it's going to be all right. But yeah, short stories, again, like the low pressure is really, really helpful. And maybe again, try a different form, try poetry, try a theater show, try fantasy if you've never done it, something slow, something low pressure. Oof, it can be tough. All right, will you all please give a hand to Shannon and Paul, who are incredible. These books are so beautiful. They're so awesome. Every sentence is a masterclass. Please, please, please get them. Thank you all so much.
Thanks for moderating. Thanks,
Yay,
Paul.
love you guys so much. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, everyone.